Martin Luther King Jr. was a symbolic hero back in the 1960s during the civil rights movement to end racial segregation and discrimination. On January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, his father was Reverend Martin Luther King and Alberta Williams King. He had an older sister named Willie Christine King and a younger brother named Alfred Daniel Williams. King was attending Booker T. Washington High School and was later accepted as an early admission into Atlanta Morehouse College. King then decided to become a minister and went to Boston University to get his doctorate degree. While studying at Boston University, King met Coretta Scott. Not long after, on June 18, 1953, they got married. Martin and Coretta had 4 kids of their own, which were Yolanda, Martin Luther King III, Dexter, and Bernice Scott. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks, the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white man. She then was arrested and sent to jail because of her act of defiance inspired of burgeoning civil rights movement in Montgomery.
And the Negro people of Montgomery have refused to ride the buses ever since. They walked instead. They rode in cars, their own cars, and of anyone who would give them a lift. The buses waited still and lonely in their silent rows, or rode empty through the streets. They were threatened and intimidated, arrested, convicted, and fined, and still they walked. In the rain and the sun and the dark of night, they walked with God and shunned the buses. They walked with God and they rode with God too, for they formed a carpool that was a marvel of quick organization. A network of cars, old and new, of trucks and taxis, reached out across the city and carried people where they wanted to go. It started as a one-day protest, nothing more.
After 382 days of walking to work, being harassed, and being beat up in the streets, the bus boycott was finally over. In 1956, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was formed, more known as the SCLC. The organization was formed to find a strategy for ending segregation, and they elected King to be the president. In 1960, a group of black students began the sit-in movement in North Carolina. The students were going to sit at a racially segregated lunch counters. When they were asked to leave or sit in their designated area, they would remain seated. King encouraged the students to use the nonviolent methods during the protest. Mahatma Gandhi inspired King to use the nonviolent method, which promoted civil disobedience for the best method to fight for civil rights. The protesters did their very best to remain peaceful. They were still occasionally met with violence from authorities. In 1963, King was arrested during a rally in Birmingham. While he was in jail, he wrote a letter which is famously known as the Letter from Birmingham Jail. In this letter, King wrote about his views on racial justice and nonviolence. The letter became the manifesto of the civil rights movement and inspired blacks to join the cause. On August 28, 1963, King delivered one of his most famous speeches to a massive group of civil rights marchers gathered all around the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The March on Washington got more than 200,000 people there. At this march, King delivered his speech, "I Have a Dream," emphasizing his belief that someday all men could be brothers, or in other words, all men are equal. On January 1964, Time magazine honored King as Man of the Year, and later in December, King received the Nobel Peace Prize. He was the youngest person to receive the prize for his efforts to end segregation and racial discrimination through nonviolent means.
Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I accept the Nobel Prize for Peace At a moment when 22 million Negroes of the United States are engaged in a creative battle to end the long night of racial injustice.
On March 7, 1965, the Edmund Pettus Bridge incident happened where 600 civil marchers headed east out of Selma. They only got as far as the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which was 6 blocks away, where the marchers were beaten and tear-gassed. On the 27th of March, King and 25,000 other protesters marched from Selma to Montgomery for voting rights. Later on, Lyndon B. Johnson signed the 1965 Voting Rights Act into law. In March 1968, King led striking sanitation workers in a march in Memphis, Tennessee. The march erupted in violence. King delivered his last speech, "I've Been on the Mountaintop," at the rally at Mason Temple, Memphis. After giving his last speech on April 3rd, while standing on the balcony of his room at Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, King was fatally shot by a sniper's bullet and killed. King's killing sparked up riots and demonstrations in more than 100 cities. James Earl Ray, who assassinated Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4, 1968, was taken into prison for a 99-year sentence after he pleaded guilty. Ray died in prison on April 23, 1998, because of a liver failure. Martin Luther King Jr. was an important voice in the American civil rights movement and never got tired of trying to end segregation laws. His life and work have been honored with a national holiday, schools and public buildings named after him, and a memorial on Independence Mall in Washington, D.C.